Many thanks to our gratitude band and their guests today, and to our choir, as Bob has a Sunday off. We are fortunate to have so much talent lead us and help us worship. I'm going to be reading today from Genesis chapter 37, 18 through 21. The context of this is the story of Joseph. Remember, Joseph was the youngest son of Jacob and was given this beautiful cloak. And the brothers, and he's talking about his dreams, about his brothers bowing down to him, and he was really an annoying little brother. And yet they did not like him too much, and I think maybe a little bit fearful of how much attention he was getting, as there was a lot of concern that the normal ways of giving land and property would have been disrupted by his father's affections for him, so they plotted to kill him. And we join in the story there, starting at verse 18. They saw him, that is Joseph, from a distance, and before he came near to them, they conspired to kill him. They said to one another, "Here comes this dreamer. Come now, let us kill him and throw him into one of the pits. Then we shall say that a wild animal has devoured him, and we shall see what will become of his dreams." But when Reuben heard it, he delivered him out of their hands, saying, "Let us not take his life." This passage is read often when we think of Martin Luther King, because Martin Luther King Jr. is so famous for the dream that he communicated at the Washington Mall about the dream of a new world. And he talked often of this beloved community, of moving towards a beloved community. It's a term that was not coined by him. It was coined by the 20th century philosopher Josiah Royce, who founded the Fellowship of Reconciliation, who Dr. King was a member of. Yet Martin Luther King was one who really popularized it and brought it to the forefront of society at the time. It was not just a lofty utopian goal, this unachievable idea that everybody could be nice and agree with one another. It wasn't the rapturous image of the peaceable kingdom where lions and lambs lie down together and exist in harmony. It was something more realistic, the beloved community, an achievable goal, one that could be attained by a critical mass of people committed to and trained in the philosophy and methods, particularly of non-violence. Knowing that there would be conflicts, knowing that there would always be disagreements, knowing there would always be differences, yet committing to be in those differences in a non-violent way. As early as 1956, Dr. King spoke the beloved kingdom as the end goal of all the non-violent boycotts and marches. He said in a speech at a victory rally following the announcement of a favorable U.S. Supreme Court decision desegregating the seats on Montgomery buses, he said, "The end is reconciliation. The end is redemption. The end is the creation of the beloved community. It is the type of spirit and this type of love that can transform opponents into friends. It is this type of understanding goodwill that will transform the deep gloom of the old age into the exuberant gladness of the new age. It is this love which will bring about miracles in the hearts of men." Yet here we are many years later, and we see a world where it seems like maybe we are only a little bit further, or maybe not even further at all, towards that way of a beloved community. And what gets in the way of that? What gets in the way of our ability to be transformed, to allow miracles in the hearts of men and women to take place, to transform us more and more into a people who can live together in peace and with justice? Well, I think a big thing is fear. I listened to a new series on NPR called Invisibilia. It's a podcast, fascinating, looking at all the things, the invisible things that affect human behavior. Those things that maybe we don't see in the forefront. And this last one, they focus on fear and what fear is. They looked first at a doctoral student at Clark University who in the mid-70s had a strong interest in child development, Roger Hart. He spent 2 years interviewing at length every child in this one Vermont town who between 4 and 12 and mapping where they played in the town. And he documented how they played and where they played. And the kids of this town had the run of the town. They were all over the place. They were even all the way as far as the nearby lake where you think maybe kids weren't allowed to go. And this is without parents. They played in the forest and they did their own thing. And the parents, and the thing that Roger Hart noticed, the parents simply were not fearful. They felt completely comfortable in the mid-70s with their kids being out, playing, and just being kids. Well, decades later, he returned to that very same town and interviewed the children of those original children. Many of them had stayed in the area and had their own kids, and they mapped to where those kids played, and it was starkly different. It was just around the house, in the yard. Maybe if there was a park across the street, they would be across the street. And he's mapping where the kids would play without the presence of an adult watching them. And he interviewed the parents, and instead of finding what their parents, the attitudes of their parents, they found a very different attitude, one of fear and anxiety, of stranger danger and anxiety. Even though that town, its crime statistics had not changed, nothing had changed as far as how much crime or events or anything happening in that particular town. There was this increased level of fear and anxiety. What had changed? Even though this town hadn't necessarily changed, what had changed in the hearts of people and parents? Well, one thing is technology and the creation of our news cycles and the more fear-inducing news stories that we have access to around the world. Making the world much smaller and also making us realize how much bad stuff does take place in the world and what could happen. And that this raised the level of anxiety, being bombarded by news and by stories and by seeing what happens in the world. I went on to look at and talk a little bit about the science of fear. And we actually have a fear center in our brain. The amygdala is designed, in an evolutionary way, is designed to help protect us and to react with fear, to protect our lives, and to be people who will not die and be able to react to real threats. And that this gets stimulated and causes us to be in a more fearful, anxious state. And it can be stimulated by just hearing about a fearful thing, not necessarily being witness to it or present or having it even be close to us, but just by hearing about it and by constantly hearing about it, having just a constant stimulation of our fear centers. And as we saw in the news and seen what's happened in the world and the scary and fear-inducing and heartbreaking news that came out of Paris, and then following that, the massacre in Nigeria, the threats recently to our own capital in Washington, D.C. All of these things are scary. And the news, and we talk about it and analyze it and hear about it over and over again, and hopefully we're not leaving our news on all the time. But if you do, you cannot help but listen to it. Many are kept in this perpetual state of fear. Just what I think the terrorists want us to be in. Well, on this, in this show, another neuroscientist was researching fear, and she actually collected the sweat of people who were about to jump out of airplanes for the first time. Parachute. She collected the sweat just before they were about to jump out, the very first time they were going to skydive. And then she put people in MRIs, and she wafted that sweat in their nose, and the fear center of their brain lit up by the sweat of those who were afraid. She took sweat from those same people who were jumping on the airplane while they were exercising and not scared, and it did not have the same result. We do literally smell fear. Fear does spread. And we've all heard it. If you work with horses, you know horses can detect fear. Well, that's true too. Interspecies detection of fear has been documented as well. Fear is contagious, and it spreads, and we sense it, and people can sense it in us, and it grows exponentially. That's why mass hysteria, and when something happens in an event, it can be so terrifying when a group is trying to get out of a building or something. It spreads, and it's deep in our nature. It's not just a conscious thing, but a reaction in us to protect ourselves. Why do I start off a sermon with this about fear? Because fear has always been a part of us. Down to our most animalistic and evolutionary core, fear has been a part of us. We've learned to live with fear. We've learned how to respond to fear. And much of history is just about how we react when we're afraid. And the two primary modes we go into when we sense fear and when we have fear is fight or flight. Fight is becoming aggressive and defending ourselves. And we've done this as a country. We've become aggressive and going after those who perpetrate such brutal acts of terrorism. Invaded lands, we've hunted people down, we've tortured people, we've imprisoned terrorists and alleged terrorists. We've used invasions, missiles, snipers, and drones, all to go and fight and attack. Flight, on the other hand, is to get away from the threat, and we see that too in how we build our walls. We try to protect what we have. We try to protect our world. We increase security. We give up some of our liberty for security, and we keep our children closer. Become helicopter parents, as they're called. Both modes have been necessary in our lives and our human race. But the thing that's pointed out by this look at fear, and also from what we look at today in Scriptures, is that we have another ability that most species do not. We have another ability that most species do not. When we have fear, we have an ability to do something else. When Dr. King faced a system that was designed to keep minorities fearful and in their place, through threat of violence or through violence, he didn't fight as many others wanted to do and tried to do. He didn't fight with violence. And he didn't flee either. But he marched, making himself even more vulnerable, and stood up, facing that fear. We have this ability to interrupt our fight or flight reaction. We have this ability to overcome our fear with thought, with conscience. And this too has been crucial for our survival. We can override those base instincts and think about what is really going on, and is my perception really what's truly happening? And can I respond in a different way than fighting or fleeing? I read how Reuben interrupted his brother's murderous rage against their brother. And they were afraid of the favor that Joseph had with their father, a potential threat to all of their future. But Reuben was able to interrupt that fearful collusion and say, let us not kill. And just after that, let's not spill any blood. Let's not be violent. And his life was spared. And Joseph, of course, went on in that story to be the Savior for his family, for his brothers as they faced famine. And in Jesus' time, many Jewish leaders gained followings who advocated violent revolution. They traded Jesus, a violent revolutionary, Barabbas, for Jesus. Would rather have the violent guy go free than Jesus, the peaceful one, go free when he was crucified. The disciples, even when they went to arrest Jesus, wanted to fight, according to Luke. And Jesus said, let's not. There's a different way and a better way. When tensions were rising between blacks and whites and some wanted to riot and lash out, Dr. King said, let's not. There's a better way, a different way. Those many Muslims massacred in Nigeria were massacred because they were cooperating with security forces trying to root out the extremists in their own land. They too saying, let's not join in with the violent extremist ways. And in Ferguson and in New York and where people are protesting, we don't hear about the many peaceful protesters who are shouting to the anarchists who want to be violent, let's not do it that way. Let's be peaceful. Let us protest in the way of Dr. King. And yet our irrational fear and the fear that makes headlines does not let us hear the other stories of those saying, let's not. The fear doesn't let us see statistics that from FBI that between 2004 and 2013, of the 540 police officers who have been killed by another person or by people, 52% of those people were white. 43% were black. And yet our irrational fear still has us thinking that the violent ways of blacks are why they're being killed by police more than white. We are living, too, in one of the most peaceful periods in history. Statistically, and as far as wars go, we have not seen this kind of peace. We have not seen these low numbers of those dying in warfare. In our own country, our violent crimes and crime in general has dropped dramatically. And yet fear keeps us in the state to believe that everything is worse. And the world is scarier. We hear the news, we see the images, we see the violent events coming through, and we're sent to a place of fear. And yes, it is scary. Violent extremists are scary. It's heart-wrenching. What are they doing to people? What they have done in Paris and Nigeria to Muslim girls who just try to go to school. It is scary the way that they use violence and have no regard for life at all. But we have to be aware of what we're going to do. Not go right to those places of fight or flight automatically. Not back to our walls and believing that we're the right religion or the right way and demonizing others. We have to go to those places where we can override our base instinct and think about what is really going on and respond in a different way. How can we be the voice that says, let us not? Let us not do it that way. Let us not let fear take control. We can remember in that journey and in that purpose 6 principles of nonviolence that were brought up in Stride Toward Freedom, Dr. King's first book. First, nonviolence is the way of life for courageous people. It's not easy to have your fear and yet still say, let us not. It is an act of nonviolent resistance to evil. It is aggressive spirituality, mentally and emotionally. Principle 2, nonviolence seeks to win friendship and understanding. The end result of nonviolence is redemption and reconciliation. The purpose of nonviolence is the creation of this beloved community. Principle 3, nonviolence seeks to defeat injustice, not people. Nonviolence recognizes that evildoers are also victims often and are not necessarily evil people. The nonviolent resistor seeks to defeat evil, not people. And principle 4, nonviolence holds that suffering can educate and transform. Nonviolence accepts suffering. It says it's part of the world. It's what is real. Unfortunately, there is suffering in the world, but does not retaliate. Unearned suffering is redemptive and has tremendous educational and transforming potential. Principle 5, nonviolence chooses love, not hate. Nonviolence resists violence of the spirit as well as the body. Nonviolent love is spontaneous, unmotivated, unselfish, and creative. And principle 6, nonviolence believes that the universe is on the side of justice. That God is on the side of justice. The resistor who is nonviolent has a deep faith that justice will eventually win and believes that God is a God of justice. Now, I know I certainly had to fight back off of my own cynicism when I'm confronted with what's happening in the world. But I stop and I listen and I hear the stories of the few who stand up. The few who say, let us not, and have hope. One of those people was in an article in the New York Times on December 26th, just this last year. Usaid Barho was a kid who grew up in Syria, playing soccer, not particularly religious, loved Jackie Chan movies. He wanted to become a doctor. But then his life took a detour and things went wrong, and disruptions in Syria caused a great amount of suffering for his family and for his community. And he eventually joined up with ISIS and with that group, as many of his colleagues did, because of the promises they made to him. And yet, while he was at training camps and things with them, he became disillusioned. First, by the violence they were advocating, by how hateful they were towards Shiite Muslims and other Muslims, as well as to the world. And two, how hypocritical they saw their actions. Whereas they would punish a girl in a town for a minor infraction, while they themselves, back at the camps, were smoking cigarettes, drinking, and even having sex with each other. And so he wanted out. And the only way he saw out was to volunteer to be a suicide bomber. And they had fitted him with this jacket with a vest full of explosives and told him to go blow himself up in front of a Shiite mosque. But instead of doing that, he found the first officer he could once he got away from his handlers and went to them and said and told him, unzipped his jacket, said, I have explosives and I don't want to blow myself up or anybody else. And fortunately, they were able to get that vest off. Nobody was injured or killed. He said, let us not. We need those voices. We need to lift up those voices of the many of those who were massacred in Nigeria who say, let us not. Let us not go to those places of fight or flight automatically. Let us find a different way of peace, of nonviolence. We need those who are inspired by Dr. King and his commitment to nonviolence, saying, let us not. Let us face systematic racism where it still exists and say, let us not be violent. We need those, the Christians, the Muslims, the Hindus, the Jew, the agnostic, the atheist, of all people of every religion to say, let us not go to that place of fear. Let's be a people of peace and nonviolence. It is these voices that break, just as Jesus did, the cycles of violence. It is these voices that bring us closer and closer to a world that is transformed to look more like the kingdom of God, the beloved community. And we too can be that voice when we face those who are fearful, when we face our own fears, saying, let us not. Thanks be to God.